What if the moments that made the least sense in your life were never mistakes? Not the setbacks. Not the losses. Not even the quiet feeling that you never fully belonged anywhere. What if that lingering question, why does my life feel unfinished, is not a sign that something went wrong, but a signal that something important is still waiting? There's a certain kind of person this message is meant for. People who have lived long enough to gather experience, but still feel like their real purpose hasn't fully revealed itself. If you've ever felt like you were carrying something invisible, like your life had a meaning you couldn't quite name, like you were preparing for something without knowing what it was, then this isn't random. Some ideas, like those associated with Edgar Cayce, suggest that certain lives follow a deeper pattern. One that only begins to make sense when you stop looking backward and start asking what all of it was preparing you for. And if you're here, hearing this now, it might be time to consider that your story isn't over. It's just reaching the part that matters most. To understand why your life may feel this way, you have to look at the moment you entered the world. The year 1945 didn't just mark the end of a war, it marked a fracture. Not only in nations and economies, but in something deeper, the emotional and spiritual fabric of humanity itself. According to the teachings associated with Edgar Cayce, moments like these don't pass without response. When humanity reaches a breaking point, something answers, not by chance, but by design. He suggested that certain souls are not randomly born into these periods. They are sent. Not new souls, but experienced ones. Souls that have lived through upheaval before. Souls that understand collapse, recovery, and transformation at a level that can't be taught, only remembered. And beginning around 1945, many of these souls began arriving. Not to escape the chaos, but to enter it with purpose. They came carrying something invisible, a kind of inner knowing, a quiet resilience, a depth that doesn't always fit the surface of everyday life. If you've ever felt older than your years, or like you see things others don't quite notice, this idea suggests there may be a reason. Not because you're different by accident, but because you were placed here with intention. If you were born into this period, you didn't just witness change, you were placed in the middle of it. You grew up close enough to the old world to understand its values, discipline, structure, survival. But you also lived through the rise of something entirely new. Technology, cultural shifts, new ways of thinking that rewrote the rules almost overnight. It can feel like standing with one foot in each world, never fully belonging to either. Too different from the generation before you. Too grounded for the generation after you. And that in-between feeling? It's easy to mistake it for disconnection. But ideas linked to Edgar Cayce suggest something else entirely, that this position was intentional. Because real change doesn't come from one side alone. It requires someone who can understand both, and translate between them. That's what a bridge does. It doesn't choose one side. It holds both. And maybe that's why your life has felt the way it has. Not because you were meant to fit neatly into a single role or identity, but because you were meant to connect worlds that don't naturally understand each other. Not stuck in the middle, but placed there. What if your life didn't begin at birth, but with a decision? Some teachings connected to Edgar Cayce describe a moment before incarnation, where a soul chooses the outline of its next life. Not every detail, but the essential conditions, the environment, the challenges, the kinds of experiences that would shape what it came here to become. Seen through that lens, the difficult parts of your story take on a different meaning. The family that didn't understand you. The paths that didn't work out. The relationships that broke something open inside you. Not random. Not punishment. But pressure, applied in very specific ways to form something that couldn't exist otherwise. Because growth like this isn't theoretical. It isn't something you can be told. It has to be lived, tested, and earned. And if that's true, then your life is not a series of disconnected events. It's a sequence. Preparation for something that requires exactly what you've learned, through experience, not instruction. So the real question shifts. Not, why did this happen to me? But, what has all of this been preparing me for? If this path sounds familiar, it doesn't stay abstract for long. There are patterns, specific, repeatable signs that tend to show up in people who carry this kind of life trajectory. Ideas linked to Edgar Cayce point to 5 in particular. First, a kind of exhaustion that rest doesn't fix. Not physical tiredness, but something deeper, like you've been carrying weight for longer than this life alone. Second, a quiet sense of not fully belonging. You can connect with people, even care deeply, but there's always a part of you that remains, outside the frame. Third, you notice patterns early. In people, in systems, in situations, you often feel what's coming before there's visible proof. Fourth, others are drawn to you for guidance. Not because of a title, but because something in your presence feels steady, grounded, or safe. And fifth, despite everything you've already lived through, there's a persistent sense that your most important chapter hasn't happened yet. Not wishful thinking. More like recognition. If several of these resonate, the question isn't whether you fit a label. It's why these patterns exist so consistently, and what they might be pointing toward. There's a part of this path that isn't often talked about openly. The same traits that make these individuals perceptive, intuitive, and steady for others, also make life heavier. Teachings associated with Edgar Cayce describe this as a kind of openness, an ability to feel beyond the surface. Not just your own emotions, but the atmosphere of a room, the unspoken tension in relationships, even the weight carried by others. And over time, that adds up. You may have found yourself holding space for people long before you had the words for it. Absorbing family stress as a child. Taking on emotional burdens in relationships. Feeling affected by situations that others seem to brush off easily. It's not weakness. It's permeability. But without boundaries, that openness turns into exhaustion. Because when you carry what isn't yours for too long, it begins to feel like it is. That's where the real challenge begins. Not learning how to feel more, but learning how to feel without losing yourself inside what you feel. Not shutting down, but standing steady. Because the ability to sense deeply is part of the role. But so is knowing where you end, and everything else begins. If all of this has been preparation, then preparation for what? Ideas associated with Edgar Cayce point to 3 core assignments. Not job titles or roles you apply for, but functions you naturally carry out, often without realizing it. The first is ancestral healing. You may be the one who sees patterns in your family that others ignore, cycles of silence, conflict, or disconnection. And instead of repeating them, something in you resists. When you choose differently, even in small ways, it doesn't just change your life. It interrupts the pattern itself. The second is stabilization. In uncertain situations, people tend to settle around you. You might not say much, but your presence creates calm. That isn't accidental, it's a form of grounding that others rely on more than they realize. The third is transmission. Not formal teaching, but sharing what you've learned through experience. A conversation, a story, a moment of honesty, these become ways of passing something forward that can't be taught from theory alone. None of this requires perfection. It only requires that you show up as you are, and allow what you've lived through to have value beyond you. There's a point in life where something subtle begins to shift. Not on the surface, externally, things may look the same. But internally, the pressure to prove, to chase, to keep up, starts to loosen. What once felt urgent begins to feel optional. And something quieter, but stronger, starts to take its place. Teachings linked to Edgar Cayce describe this as a kind of second beginning, not physical, but internal. It often happens later than expected. In a culture that emphasizes youth, this phase can be easy to overlook. But for those on this path, it marks a transition from preparation into clarity. The roles you played to navigate earlier decades no longer fit the same way. The need for approval fades. And what remains is more direct, less filtered. Not a new identity, but a clearer version of what was already there. This is where experience begins to integrate. Where insight stops being theoretical and becomes something you can stand on. And instead of asking, "What should I do next?" the question becomes, what is already ready to be expressed? Because this phase isn't about starting over. It's about finally working with what you've been building all along. At some point, the question is no longer about understanding your life. It becomes about using it. Teachings associated with Edgar Cayce describe a stage often called the final activation. Not a dramatic event. Not something external that suddenly changes everything. It's a shift in how you show up. A moment, sometimes quiet, where you stop waiting to feel fully ready. Where the hesitation, the self-doubt, the question of, "Who am I to do this?" begins to lose its authority. Because the truth is, that voice doesn't disappear on its own. It fades when you move despite it. This stage rests on three simple shifts. First, recognition, seeing your life not as random events, but as a body of experience that has value. Second, permission, realizing no one is going to tell you it's time. That decision belongs to you. Third, action, not large, public gestures, but small, consistent moments of alignment. Speaking honestly. Showing up fully. Choosing not to hold back when it matters. It doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with willingness. Because the turning point isn't when everything becomes clear. It's when you stop waiting for clarity and start moving anyway. If you've followed this far, then something in you has already recognized the pattern. Not as an idea, but as a memory. Because when a perspective resonates this deeply, it doesn't feel new. It feels familiar. As if something you've always known. Quietly, privately, has finally been put into words. Teachings connected to Edgar Cayce suggest that lives like yours are not defined by how they begin, but by how they come together over time. And that time is now. You were born into a period of disruption, change, and uncertainty. Not to be overwhelmed by it, but to stand within it differently. To steady what feels unstable. To bring clarity where there is confusion. To carry forward something that cannot be replaced. Not because you have all the answers. But because you've lived through enough to recognize what matters. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about no longer holding back who you already are. And if there's even a small part of you that feels ready, then you don't need more time. You just need to begin. Before you move on, take a moment to pause, not to analyze, but to notice. What, if anything, stayed with you? Maybe it was a single idea. Maybe a sentence that felt unusually personal. Or just a quiet sense that something here connected in a way you didn't expect. If that happened, don't rush past it. Teachings often linked to Edgar Cayce suggest that recognition doesn't come loudly. It comes subtly, through moments like this, where something inside you responds before your mind has time to explain it. So here's a simple way to acknowledge that moment. Write 2 words in the comments, "I remembered." Not for anyone else, but as a marker for yourself. A way of saying, "I noticed. I didn't ignore it." And if you know someone who might be in a similar place, someone who's lived a lot, but still feels like there's more ahead, share this with them. Not everyone will relate. But the right person will. Because sometimes, a single message arrives at exactly the right time. And changes what someone chooses to do next.